Hi there, Aaron.
Hi.
This is my friend Aaron Weiss, and we are here today to yak about Dharma. Aaron's a doctoral candidate at California Institute for Integral Studies, and in Asian and Comparative Religions, right? And
Asian and Comparative Studies.
Comparative Studies, okay. And so we've been having a lot of fun talking about the sort of higher end Mahayana material, jumping into the deep end of the pool last week with what is prajna and what is wisdom, or sherap in Tibetan. And that sort of leads into another question that these words come up: prajna, a Sanskrit word, and then upaya, which is sometimes translated as method, sometimes as skillful means. You can talk more about that. And there's a sense that these two aspects are both necessary for a bodhisattva on the path of awakening. And so I've asked Aaron back again this week to talk to us about how we wrap our head around that, what that means, prajna and upaya. And we have a greeting here for you from Douglas Broadley.
Oh, great.
And John Petit. My goodness, we have two scholarly Dharma brothers.
Yes,
tuning
fantastic.
in tonight. We've
great
got to up our game.
Yeah, I'm glad they're both here. That's great.
So tell me about prajna and upaya. What does that even mean?
Yeah. Okay. Well, last week, as I mentioned, the notion of prajna really gets to the heart of Buddhism because it relates to the kind of discriminating awareness that characterizes wisdom. It's the complete and genuine discernment of all phenomena. And upaya is sort of the action phase of that. If prajna is the kind of wisdom heart of Buddhism, then upaya is the action of Buddhism in life and in the world. And the two are necessarily interrelated, and we'll get to that. But for now, maybe we'll dwell on upaya for a second. Upaya, as a term, it means a way of getting something done. As you said, it's like a method. It can refer to a stratagem, like, in the sense of being in a conflict and needing a strategy to win. So it has that kind of broader connotation in Sanskrit. So here, in the context of Buddhism, upaya can refer to three different kinds of methods or approaches. One is what it takes to achieve Buddhism, or to achieve enlightenment.
Yeah.
That's funny. Well, it is achieving Buddhism, to attain enlightenment. And then the second sense is the activities that bodhisattvas, that is to say, advanced practitioners on this path, the activities that bodhisattvas do to benefit beings in the world. And then a third sense of upaya is what you described as skillful means, which is a broader or a more specific term. It's a longer word, upaya kaushalya, skillful means. And that refers to the kind of the pedagogical skill or communicative power that enlightened beings have. And their ability to create a situation that is auspicious and creates the ability for sentient beings to receive teachings and attain some insight and liberation from suffering for themselves. So as an example of that latter piece, there's a famous story that's told in the tradition that when the Buddha attained enlightenment, he was sitting under a Bodhi tree, as it's called, the enlightenment tree, and attained awakening, and he was in the forest, and as the story goes, he said, "This truth that I have discovered is so profound and subtle that it will be very difficult for beings to understand it. And so maybe I'll just stay here in the woods and sort of abide in this blissful understanding." And when this god, Brahma, heard the Buddha, was able to sense the Buddha's thought, he came to the Buddha and said, please recognize that there are some beings in the world who could benefit from your teachings. Please do teach. And so then the Buddha taught. Now, the tradition understands this in the following way. The Buddha, as enlightenment itself, inherently and from the beginning was always going to share this wisdom and benefit beings. But in order to create a positive, auspicious circumstance, the Buddha stayed back and had that thought in order to induce Brahma to request the teachings and thus create that auspicious circumstance for that connection to be brought about in the best possible way. And so this is described as the Buddha's skillful means, okay? So when we talk about the interplay of Prajna and Upaya, it's present in all three of these different contexts of the practices that are done in order to attain enlightenment, beneficial action of bodhisattvas, and then the pedagogical skill of Buddhas, all include this union of Prajna and Upaya. So, when we think of Upaya and skillful means in the context of Buddhism, we're usually thinking about virtuous activities that accord with the nature of reality and accord with the exercise of Prajna. And so this raises a question of Buddhist ethics, which I think might be good to talk about a little bit in this context. And that's because the reason I think it's important to talk about is because Buddhist ethics doesn't exactly correlate with the same notions of good and evil that we may have received from, say, if you were raised in the Abrahamic traditions or something like that. And so to understand ethics in the Buddhist context, I think it's good to take a look at the basic framework of what's called the Four Noble Truths. And that's, the basic experience that life includes inevitable suffering. The Buddha said in his very first teaching, he said, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, and death is suffering. And suffering relates to experiences of having what you don't want come to you, losing what it is that you have that you wish to keep, or not being able to get what it is that you wanted. And that is all, those experiences of suffering, according to the Buddhist teaching, are all summarized in clinging to the five aggregates, the five psychophysical aggregates that bring about or that constitute the body, mind, and the world that we live in. And so the whole idea is that suffering is brought about through grasping and fixation upon our experience. And that brings about suffering because our experience isn't fixable like that. The world is in a flux. Everything is impermanent and flowing, and everything is finely tuned in its responsiveness to events around it. So things are inherently unstable. And so if you're going to try to, build a castle on that sand, you're going to end up sad. And so the idea with Buddhism is to address suffering at its root, which is the state of ignorance that brings about an attitude of clinging, attachment, and aversion, and then the negative actions that we do on the basis of that delusion and those negative attitudes, which result in bad effects coming back to us due to the inherently interconnected nature of all things. And so, there's non-virtuous states that are associated with body, speech, and mind, and we could list those out, but you can summarize them all as falling under the categories of greed, hate, and delusion, with delusion being the kind of core one that then leads to these deluded attitudes of greed or clinging, grasping, and then aversion or hatred. And so that's the idea. But then again, with the Four Noble Truths, it's not just suffering. Suffering isn't just sort of arbitrary. It has causes. And that's the second truth, is that suffering has a cause. But if suffering has a cause, then we can realize that suffering has an end. And that end is, the famous nirvana. This word literally means extinction. And so we can think of it as the extinction of negative states of suffering, right? And so we've got suffering. We understand that it has causes, which is rooted in ignorance and delusion. And then it has an end. And so then the Buddha teaches the fourth noble truth, which is the path to achieving that end. And that's the basic framework where we think about Buddhist ethics, what it is good to do, or what constitutes wholesome or unwholesome action. So in this way of thinking, particular entities or actions or events are not inherently good or evil. The idea is to ask whether a being or an action is in attune with this path to bring about the end of suffering or not. And whether or not a particular action is good depends on its context. And so it leads to an interesting situation. I mean, there's a sutra called the Upaya Kaushalya Sutra, I think, the Sutra of Skillful Means, which actually says that Bodhisattvas who have the right kind of intention and the right sort of understanding of the nature of reality are able to do actions that for normal beings would result in negative outcomes. But because Bodhisattvas have wisdom and they have the proper sort of orientation or attunement or motivation, then they can perform the same actions and they have a positive result. So here we're really getting to the power and the importance, the centrality of intention and motivation in what we're doing, and in the clarity of our own minds as we act. And that's what really kind of renders something as good or bad. But instead of good or bad, they use the words skillful or unskillful. So the Sanskrit there is kushala and akushala. And so that's really kind of the crux of Buddhist ethics. And the idea with these kinds of virtues is, again, that they're the activities that support the path that brings about the end of ignorance, which is the root of suffering. And so, you know, our text, Gampopa's Jewel Ornament of Liberation, in this chapter, it speaks of a kind of integral interrelation of Prajna, that discriminating insight or wisdom, and then Upaya as a kind of attuned and skillful and fitting action. And the two rely on each other, which is to say that if you're going to try to recognize the nature of mind and abide in that wisdom and attain it, you need to support that process with positive actions. And you need to create a sort of positive momentum in your life so that you bring about circumstances that are conducive to your own mind's, calming and peace. So let's say if you're a really violent person and you're making a lot of discord in your environment around you everywhere you go, you're not making it very easy for yourself to attain the states of calm and clarity that are required to be able to see the nature of one's own mind and attain the liberation that comes from that. So in that sense, these practices of what we're calling virtue or generating positivity are important for the sake of prajna. And Shantideva, the great writer on these topics of Mahayana Buddhism, in his book, I have it here, The Way of the Bodhisattva, which is a book I hope everyone watching this will read ASAP. He says in his chapter on wisdom that everything that's come before this, the whole discussion of all the other 5 paramitas, has been for the sake of wisdom. So there's a kind of a support of wisdom and a kind of lifestyle of wisdom. And that's kind of the ordinary or basic sense of virtue. But if these virtues are going to be really efficacious as means for bringing about the kind of quite radical outcome that Buddhism is going for, something beyond just health into omniscience and realization of the nature of ultimate truth, then just doing good or being positive isn't going to be sufficient to do it. The tradition holds that it's important to have this incisive awareness, to have this first-person comprehension of the ultimate nature of mind. And that can only be done through this sort of incisive clarity. And when that clarity is brought to bear, so we're talking here about prajna, we can speak of it as being perfected, right? Prajna, you could think of it as one of the virtues itself, the virtue of seeing clearly and being able to discern good from bad or up from down, etc. But when we characterize things as paramita, right, that is to say that they're gone beyond or they are perfections, then what is meant there is that the virtue is being exercised in connection with this insight that recognizes the open dimension of being, or what's called emptiness, shunyata in Sanskrit, tongpanyi in Tibetan. And that is, as I said, the kind of open dimension of being. It's a mode of awareness that is not structured in terms of a subject on this side and an object on that side, but rather an unconditioned kind of primordial wisdom which pervades all phenomena. And so when prajna, when that sense of discernment is turned toward the mind, and the kind of the truth of its open and luminous dimension is recognized, then we can speak of the prajna paramita, the incisive, discriminating awareness gone beyond all limitations. And so it is with the other virtues, the first 5 paramitas, which we can classify as the upaya side of the equation. The 6 paramitas are another way of describing the twofold prajna and upaya, the first 5 being upaya and then prajna. Now, the first 5 virtues turn into perfections, or virtues that are efficacious on a path toward ultimate realization, when they are done outside, again, once again, outside of this stricture of a fixation on me over here doing a virtuous thing, which is its own fixated idea, toward others who are, again, fixated on as other and concretely separate and sort of independently existing for themselves. When we exercise kindness or patience or generosity toward others, and we're not fixated in that way, like, what is this going to do for me, for example, then the positivity, or the merit, as it's called, of those actions is not limited by this sort of prior restriction that we've put on things through fixating on a notion of self and other. And so then the scope of positivity that correlates with those actions is unbounded. So we can speak about generosity gone beyond. That would be the dana paramita. So that emptiness is kind of the key. It's the glue that holds all of Buddhism together, and it's what makes the interrelation of prajna, or incisive awareness, and then the exercise of goodness. That's what makes them efficacious as a spiritual path. Is that all clear so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question. Sort of, you can inject. You're on a roll, but I want you to add into the roll.
Sure.
How to address the 5th paramita, samten dhyana, as you're talking about mostly you're talking about upaya as sort of activity,
right?
Virtuous activity. Right. And we usually think of meditation as something other than virtuous activity, although it certainly is that. How does that fit into this upaya?
Yeah, sure. Well, once again, with to make samten or dhyana into a paramita, it needs to be brought into relation with the wisdom cognizing emptiness. And emptiness is a kind of a big term. It might be a little intimidating, but it has to do with this insight about interconnection, and a kind of insight that's summarized as choosing a middle path. So, in the Buddha's first sermon, which I've been referring to when I speak about the Four Noble Truths, the first thing he says is that the middle path is a spiritual path that is characterized neither by indulgence nor by severe self-denial and asceticism, but rather charts a middle path. And that flavor of a middle path really does pervade the Buddhist sensibility throughout doctrines of cosmology and metaphysics, psychology, and in this case, meditation. So, Buddhism arose in an environment that already had lots of yogic and spiritual activity and sort of athleticism, let's call it. A lot of, enthusiasm among basically these kind of communities of yogins and scientists and wizards that are working together to try to figure out what this is. And so there's a whole set of different kinds of meditative activities or methods that are discussed in Buddhism that are not simply Buddhist in origin. And those can result in states of what are called like a formless or a very subtle form kind of state of consciousness, where you have extreme states of relaxation where the mind is quieted so much that all of the phenomena just kind of quiet right down. And so for a time in these really sublime states, we are outside of the world, really. For a minute, we take a break from the world. And in doing that, so the tradition says, we create the karma to actually be born into states where that's the kind of baseline, and those are called God realms or Deva realms. And so to exercise the middle path in the context of meditation is to recognize that that's not really the goal. The goal is not simply to turn off the mind, to get out of the world and escape it. Rather, it's to condition the mind and make it satisfy the access conditions for realizing the nature of reality itself. It's not just for bringing about special states of consciousness. And so the exercise of prajna in the context of meditation leads to a sense of a middle path that does not privilege those extreme states, but keeps the mind and the practitioner's interest in this kind of middle region where this sort of panoramic vision of life can unfold. Is that making some sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We have a question
Okay.
from Pod.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the first 5 paramitas are described as upaya and the 6th paramita is prajna. He's now mentioning a 7th paramita I've never heard of before. The 7th paramita of upaya. Is this a higher or deeper level of upaya?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a longer set of paramitas, the 10 paramitas, which can be found in both the Great Vehicle and Vajrayana traditions. Vajrayana is Great Vehicle, and also in the Shravaka-yana and the Pratyeka Buddha-yana. So the vehicles or the pathways of those who listen to the teachings and those who attain it in kind of in solitude. And so in the Shravaka-yana, and you can find this in Pali literature today, there's discussion of 10 virtues that are perfected by bodhisattvas on their way to enlightenment, and Upaya is one of those group of 4 in that extended version. In this case, if anybody knows better than I do, please chime in. My understanding off the top of my head is that the Upaya there is like the Upaya I mentioned of the great skill in sort of pedagogical acuity, the ability to bring out or bring about ideal circumstances of communication. That would be the specific sense of upaya that's perfected by bodhisattvas there in the 7th paramita.
Is that when you're talking about somebody having the ability to do that, a great teacher?
Mm-hmm.
Are they kind of thinking it through like, wow, if I look out the window right now, while I'm teaching, that's really going to impact people in a certain way, or if I bring a dog into the room right now and they shake their butt all over the place, it's going to really shake up this teaching tonight? Or is it a non-cognitive process?
Right. Well, I don't want to limit what it is that lamas are doing or not doing. And so if we were to have a great lama say, you know what, I was thinking about that beforehand, that wouldn't register as a disappointment in my book. It would just be a brilliant person being brilliant. When it gets to like a strict discussion of these kinds of doctrinal issues, then it would be said that enlightened beings have been completely freed from the bondage of the conceptual mind. And so they no longer exist in a kind of dependence on having to create concepts in order to understand something and plans where they structure some kind of action. The metaphor of Buddha activity is said to be like the way that the moon shines, and without deciding anything, it instantaneously renders images of itself in however many buckets of water you want to lay out. Right away, instantaneously, the reflection shines perfectly. The full moon is completely reflected in each one without any effort on the part of the moon. And so to make sense of that, we shouldn't think that of the Buddha in what I'll call a kind of theistic sense where we would, not to knock theism, but what I mean is, it's not that the Buddha is some kind of like ultra fast processing power. or, some kind of grand strategy that's laid out in advance, but rather that it is simply the ongoing nature of reality right now in its mode as manifesting your own most potential for being, as reflecting back to you right now just what it is that you are, your natural condition. And so there's no need for any planning or anything, because you, as a sentient being, as being a minded person, are already carrying that potential. And so reality is perfectly responding to that, and that's Buddha activity. So, in tantric Buddhism, we start to discipline ourselves in recognizing that all phenomena, just as they are the communication of Buddhas to us.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Wow. So, Aaron, we're getting near the end. Anybody who has a question, you better ask it now or forever hold your peace. But I have one.
Okay.
So the theme of my channel here, which I don't know, I think it should be the theme of every Dharma channel, is really how do we bring we have these profound teachings, we have these profound meditations, amazing lamas and roshis and so forth in this world. Yet the world is very different than it used to be. We're facing, climate change with disastrous connotations. We have a pandemic. We have increasing disparity between rich and poor, and strifes of all kinds. And people's time is incredibly limited. They're spending more hours working, driving, and so forth than they ever have before, I believe, on average. How do we bring, we as, we're not yet bodhisattvas on the bhumis, we're aspiring bodhisattvas. What does this mean to us, this upaya and wisdom? How can we bring it into our actual experience?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. And if you get this figured out, I hope you'll keep me in the loop, because this has been a tough year for me too. Mm-hmm. Well, I think of the Tibetan word for world. The word in Tibetan for world is jigten. And the two syllables of that term, they literally say the disintegrating support. So, the world isn't just kind of like some stable entity that is hosting us for a time. It is falling apart. And that's kind of what defines it in a way. It's a sort of disintegrating container for our lives. And I would argue that this crazy, scary world is actually the world that the teachings have been talking about and that they've been preparing us for. Samsara is showing us this in this time just what it's made of, which is, change and sort of uncanny responsiveness and sort of disappointment. So the world is on fire. Is that the name of this series? And just to kind of reflect from my own self, and I hope others can, if not right now, then maybe in the future we can talk more and hear from others. But for me, the point is not to control or try to fix or escape the world, and because those are just dead ends that lead to frustration, and these Prajna teachings make that quite clear. We have actually, you know what? I wrote a few sentences just a few minutes ago, and I think I'm just going to go ahead and read them because it's 6:30. Let me just see how this goes. All right. So I said, the world is on fire. The point is not to control it, fix it, or try to escape it. Those are dead ends that lead to frustration. This world goes on and on without us, dragging us along from within. And it is alive and buzzing. It's teeming with the ongoing echoes and consequences of every past being's cry of yearning, their strivings, achievements, and follies. And this cacophonous symphony of history is us. this whole thing that's crashing down around us, it is us. Because when we go looking for self, what we find instead is the cresting wave of karmic confluence, this poetry of cause and effect proceeding without interruption. And we have an opportunity in this life to recognize the inherent luminosity of our deepest nature and to dance in its continued realization. In this reverent letting go, we can move beyond egoic bounds to find the deep confidence and satisfaction befitting of 15 billion-year-old wisdom. I'm speaking of us as sort of cosmic beings, as products of this vast interconnection. We have an opportunity to shine the light of that realization into the world, impartially benefiting beings with everything we do in every situation. And I would add that that's by bringing this prajna and upaya to our daily lives, to our work, bringing this attitude that's in these texts, that's encouraged in these practices, that attitude, that sense of incisive awareness and of compassionate intent into all of our activities, so that cooking becomes cooking paramita, driving to work becomes the driving paramita, right? And so that's done through adhering to our disciplines and refining our minds and dancing with duality.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And I think that'll wrap it up. And all I have to say is that, we're starting a study and practice program through the Mayum Mountain Foundation. You can go to mayummountain.net. Or click on the link in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And in a few days, I'll have sort of the outline of what we're going to be doing. Aaron and our friend Colin Iyer, another really terrific scholar, are going to be teaching this kind of thing that we sometimes don't get as Western practitioners. Sometimes there's, in some milieus, there's an emphasis on practice only, and I think that can lead to it can lead to a muddiness, a lack of clarity, that it can be a problem as the years go on in practice. So I'll attest to that. So they're going to clear away these clouds for us, or we're going to clear them away for ourselves also, and with both perhaps some seminars, but also peer study groups in Dharma texts, starting in next summer. And I am going to be then the practice component will be the Vajrayana, and I'll be starting a group out with the Khandro Tuktik Ngundro foundational practices, and continuing in the Khandro Tuktik cycle, which we can talk about sometime. Thank you all. Thank you for being here so much, Aaron, this week and last week. I really appreciate it. You're such a blazing light. So please keep blazing. And Douglas says, thank you. The great discussion accompanying my practice of the cooking paramita this evening. So I think this kind of hour, a lot of people are engaged in that while they watch along. Yes. We'll see you next week, and take care out there. Bye-bye now.